Hey, welcome everybody. So this is our first ABT Kindred Spirit session for the year. And last year we did it every Wednesday for about 40 weeks total. We took the month of July off and developed this kind of core group of about probably 100 people that popped in when they could, different times. And we do this in the middle of the week. So it's kind of a tough hour for a lot of people. They tend to have departmental meetings, things of that sort. But David, what you'll see is a group of friends that are kind of got quite a few shared experiences from the speakers. In fact, in this little intro thing, I'll be mentioning a couple of sessions that we did last year. And what I'm going to do here is probably take 10 to 15 minutes of a bunch of setup, since this is going to be an extra long 90-minute session that we're going to go on and a lot of stuff to dive into. I'll ask you to talk in a couple minutes, David, and everybody knows you got the flyers. David is a really prominent science journalist, my number one favorite science journalist over the years. Honest to goodness, you'll see why as we get into this stuff. Writes a lot of articles with The Atlantic and Newsweek. And here, just this morning, talking with my good friend Rick Nelson, kind of really converged on what this whole session is. I want to kind of address among many topics, but at the broadest of all levels, is it even possible to prepare? And I'm sure you've got to have a lot to say about that, David, because I mean, all your work is kind of warning about how faulty the system is. And in theory, people read these things and wake up and go, oh my God, we got to prepare and we got to start working on things. But how much is that really possible? So that's the deeper dimension. And really, at the core of that is, once upon a time, there was the horrible 9/11 event. And back then, our Congress sat up and immediately conducted an investigation that eventually produced this huge congressional report, the 9/11 Commission report. Um, Not that it did much of anything, but then we had the pandemic, and one of the things that's been talked about widely, in fact, I'll mention Michael Osterholm in a minute here, but a lot of the major epidemiologists said, can we do some sort of postmortem to figure out what the hell went wrong? Because it was an absolute nightmare, the pandemic, and there's nothing, this just doesn't happen anymore. And we can dive into why that is. But for example, this is my old buddy Michael Osterholm. We had him come talk to us like last September, the week before this book came out, and I think that said he's a great guy, director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Prevention at University of Minnesota. One of the longtime veterans, epidemiologists. I met him during the pandemic. He was on TV a bunch and on Meet the Press and began talking about narrative and the power and importance of effective communication. And that drew me in. And then he and I worked together about 3 or 4 months. I kind of helped him a bit on his podcast. And he came out with this book then just last September. And I really think, this was this big preparation book. Look at the title up there. The big one, How We Must Prepare for Future Deadly Pandemics. And I think his dream was that it would hit number one in the New York Times bestseller list. And it never really got up very high for sales. It was out of the top 1,000 on Amazon within a week or so. I followed it. And you can see today, that as of this morning, it was published in September, and there's the sales rank. It's not in the top 1,000, top 10,000, top 50,000. It's at 74,000. So how do you really coach people and get them to prepare and think about these things in today's world? Now, okay, before we even get started, I wanted to just get a little sample of David talking to us, and we're going to talk about the two articles that were on the flyer, get in depth on that, and a lot of kind of science and epidemiology type topics. But before we do there, I just came across this title yesterday, which I'd never even really looked at. A Perfect Mess, this book. The Hidden Benefits of Disorder, How Crammed Closets, Cluttered Offices, and On-the-Fly Planning Make the World a Better Place. Can you give us the 2-minute rundown on what this wonderful book was about and when was it? I should have checked that.
Yeah, let's see. That was must have been about, I'm thinking 8 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that.
Hmm.
Yeah, and yeah, so I find the easiest way to get the idea across to people is just to talk about messy desks. So I don't know if you have a messy desk, a lot of
Definitely.
incredibly effective people do. And it turns out a messy desk can be an incredibly efficient, productive, effective way of actually having the best possible access to information. Piles form naturally with the most important stuff at the top because it's the stuff you tend to access the most. And the stuff that's least important, you don't really use it very often, tends to slowly make its way to the bottom. And you spend less time. People who have really clean desks actually have to spend a fair amount of time filing things away, organizing, throwing things out. So you save time, you have the information right there. It might not look great, but it works. So it turns out that kind of thinking applies all over the place in the world and in our lives. And that's what the book's about.
And is there an optimum range of messiness there in the middle that gets too out of control? You're a hoarder or
Yes,
whatever. Yeah.
there is, and it's different for everybody. I mean, clearly, obviously, mess can become pathological and even physically dangerous, and certainly extremely inefficient and aesthetically disastrous. So you don't want to go there. But extreme neatness tends to be very inefficient, and to many people, extreme neatness is kind of cold and really doesn't look like the way a lot of people want to surround themselves in their homes with sterile, perfectly neat homes. So yeah, the trick is finding what's best for you and what works for your partner and your colleagues and friends as well, because your mess can bother other people and vice versa. So these are all things to take into account.
That's tremendous. I could go on for an hour about that topic alone. So, okay, great.
Yeah.
All right. So first little thing that we did, sorry, you got to bear with us here as I warned you. We can't help ourselves nowadays. And the cool thing is I developed these metrics over 10 years ago. They kind of sat there in hibernation for 5 years. And then Matthew came along and he began doing it in our course and began to realize, wow, these things are really pretty robust. And nowadays we're doing it a lot and we're pulling out lots of different data sets. And so, Andy Reynolds, are you there with us? Um,
Yeah,
you,
I'm here.
all right, yeah, okay.
Everybody.
Share us your thoughts because here's what we did. So Andy just yesterday sent me an email with he took a bunch of your articles and did the two basic metrics, the and frequency, how much you use the word and then the narrative index, the but to and ratio. And these two things we know a lot about them now. And what we know is there's an optimum value for the and frequency around 2.5%. When you look at really well edited material in the New Yorker and New York Times and the Atlantic, the values converge right around 2.5%. When people tend to get really verbose, they start to drift upward into over 3 and upwards of 4 and 5 really bad speeches, yada, yada. And then the but to and ratio is the reflection of how much you're doing twists and turns and tapping into the power of actual narrative structure. And that value you want to be pretty high up in the 20s ideally. And so here's what we got here. And let's see, Liz, you want to give us a guided tour here? You're the one that is the expert on, you're our narrative metrics expert.
Sure. I mean, we have here so we've previously done metrics for Michael Crichton and for William Faulkner. So the 5 red dots represent what are considered to be Crichton's five most popular works, and then the same for Faulkner, only he is the blue dots. And then David, you are the light green ones right in the middle. So. And we
There you go.
found going through them, like Faulkner is very, very prosy, very verbose, very descriptive, which is why he tends to sit low or sits very high on his and frequency, whereas say like Crichton is very action oriented and sits very low on the and frequency, and kind of vice versa for the narrative index. Randy, I'll let you take the rest from here in
No, no,
terms of the
that's really
findings.
good. Exactly. And thank you for doing this so quickly. And what we're seeing here is especially that and frequency at 2.5%, that is the optimum. And that's your editor brain, I think, or probably maybe also the editors that you work with. And I don't know that editors yet have got an analytical understanding of the and frequency. It's in the linguistics literature going all the way back to the late 90s when they did these big studies. There are graphs where they put together big data sets to show that that is the optimum. And what you find, I've talked to a number, my editor at University of Chicago Press, who's a major veteran there, she knew nothing about this, but I guarantee you that when she gets done with the work, it all converges right on that 2.5%. It's really fast. We're fascinated by it. And then as Liz was saying, you see that Crichton is kind of rougher and less literary with his writing, more action oriented, and so not the ands. And when you get to really more literary types, they use and quite a bit in the kind of their description. Andy, did you have anything more to add on that? Your thoughts? There's Charles, yay, and Doug. Uh, Nothing to say, Andy?
Only that I was struck by how sort of by the book or in the recommended range a lot of David's articles are. And also the spread interested me. So maybe if there's time later in the call, we could get into David's editing process or how perhaps different editors at The Atlantic shape different articles.
Yeah, yeah.
Because as you can see, the green spread is a lot wider than the red or the blue spread. And by the way, these are all Atlantic articles that have interested me over the years, especially the 2010 piece about the replication crisis, which was very important for those of us who work in medical quality improvement. So
Do you
David, thanks for
know?
being here. Great to meet you.
Yeah, yeah, tremendous. Do you know
Same.
which two articles those are at the top, up at 40 and 47 or something like that? Um,
No, no idea. Tell
oh
me.
no, no, no. I'm
Oh, you did.
Yeah,
sorry, you're not part of this conversation.
Yeah.
We're talking with our
yeah.
narrative nerd crew.
Let's see.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. And yeah, Liz, do you know which two
The
those are?
30 I know, I have my spreadsheet up.
Okay, which are they?
Let's see, the we're looking at narrative index, high narrative index above 40. That is, I'll race you, Liz. It's not jumping out. There it is. The worst patients in the world.
Hmm. And then what's the other one that's like 39 or something, 38?
38 was how to almost learn Italian. That's about Duolingo, the app Duolingo.
So what that's telling us is that in those you're doing a lot of twists and turns. That those are very high scores. You know, there's a lot of storytelling going on there that is what you would expect to hold the reader's interest in there. So anyhow, that's enough on that. But yeah, let's circle back to it later if we get the time. All right, so here's a few setup words for everybody in terms of what we're going to be talking about here, which is that if I had to pick one word of what this your main topic is here for today, it's you're an expert on experts. You've got your book which is titled "Wrong," and that's a lot of what we're going to get into, especially with this first article, the lies and damn lies article. What our interests are in terms of the communication works that we do. And by the way, a little update for everybody: why we've shifted to only once a month is that we're getting pretty heavily booked now with the ABT training, and we've really established a central focal point with Emory University and medical school. And now we've got two other medical schools at Washington University and University of Wisconsin that are lining up to do the ABT training as well. So now we're really establishing a nucleus of three. And that's where it really, what we're finding with the ABT is we've been in this selective process. And the environmental world, I don't think quite has gotten it. They're not quite as driven and as rigorous and analytical as the medical students are. But with them, it's an absolute bullseye. And we've run the course 4 times there in the fall at Emory University. And the reviews from last fall were absolutely tremendous. You know, they're just saying, and we're hearing from people that it's life changing. It changes the way they're thinking about their work from then forward, not just for the communication, but also the shaping of it. So it's at the core about science society. All right, I want to share a fun little thing here that kind of sets this up about this dynamic around your damn lies article. So once upon a time, when I first moved to LA in '94, I was in a writers group, and one night this woman told that she just got a new agent at the Gersh agency, and she listed who the other clients were of this agent, and one of them was this guy, John Steinbeck's son, Tom Steinbeck. And I'm lifelong Steinbeck fan, and so I instantly just said, "Would you please let me be a stalker and write a letter and give it to the agent, see if he would share it with Tom?" And make a long story short, by about a month later, he and I were sitting there getting drunk in a bar in downtown Beverly Hills, and hit it off with him for 22 years. Was really good buddies with him. This was just a year or so before he finally passed away. He was a chain smoker, and that finally took him down with all kinds of lung problems. But total character, total cantankerous, just a curmudgeon with a million stories about his dad. I couldn't get enough nights of getting drunk with him, listening to him tell stories. But he and I set to work at one point trying to do a docudrama version of the Log from the Sea of Cortez book that I loved from my back in my marine biology days. And we tried a bunch on that whole separate bunch of stories, what happened with it. But it's such an amazing book. Some of the writing in it is really spectacular, and it's from his dad, John Steinbeck. And I just want to share this one story that he and I both thought was so charming from it because it directly relates to everything we're about to talk about here. So it's so relevant that I put it in my first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. And what I'm going to do is just read you here from that book how I put it in there. So uh, in so this is what I had to say. In one of my favorite passages, so relevant to the persona of a scientist, which we're endlessly intrigued with, Steinbeck recounts the story of Jimmy Costello, a Monterey News reporter who was called to the beach one day on the news that a quote sea serpent had washed ashore. A wave of excitement had swept the town. Jimmy managed to find the creature in the assembled mob on the beach. He rushed in, approached the evil smelling monster from which the flesh was dropping. There was a note pinned to its head which said, "Don't worry about it. It's a basking shark," signed by Dr. Ralph Bolan of the Hopkins Marine Station. No doubt that Dr. Bolan acted kindly, for he loves true things. He's a scientist. Scientists love true things. But the kindness was a blow to the people of Monterey. They so wanted it to be a sea serpent. Even we hoped it would be. When sometime a true sea serpent, complete and undecayed, is found or caught, a shout of triumph will go through the world. "There, you see," men will say, "I knew they were there all the time. I just had a feeling they were there." Men really need sea monsters in their personal seas, and the old man in the sea is one of these. For the ocean, and this is pure Steinbeck writing here, it's just so beautiful. For the ocean, deep and black in the depths, is like the low, dark levels of our minds in which the dream symbols incubate and sometimes rise up to sight like the old man of the sea. And even if the symbol vision be horrible, it is there and it is ours. An ocean without its unnamed monsters would be like a completely dreamless sleep. And what do you think of that quote, David? Isn't that kind of cool? I mean, that's the fundamental divide here between the general public that wants there to be a certain level of noise and narrative. They want things to be fun and they don't want things to be cold and clinical and sterile. So we end up with this divide between the public. They want their sea serpents with all their mythical beauty, and the scientist who wants to identify everything and put the fire out and say, look, there's nothing to get excited about here. Um, and this is the fundamental divide where we work, is this divide between the two words that I've been developing slowly but surely, that are more alliterative as narrative versus numeric. And it's the idea that scientists are driven by the numeric. They want the data, they want the evidence-based decision making, and they don't really care if that puts out fires of excitement and imagination. And the public loves their narrative, and this drives so much of it. So one of the fundamental tools that we work with in the whole ABT training is this simple divide that I want to bring into the conversation that we're going to have here between the inner circle and the outer circle. So you have this inner circle, for example, in the science world, where all the scientists speak this language of sorts that's very cold and clinical. And it's very efficient for them because they know the context, and they know the consequences, and they can just spew out information, and they can bypass all these narrative principles. They can work with 6 different problems at once and multiple layers and things of that sort. I've been through these scientific departmental seminars that are very complex, and everybody's right there on the same wavelength. But most of the world is not science thinkers, and they need this basic narrative structure of setup, problem, solution. And that takes a lot of time and effort, and a lot of scientists don't want to put in the time and effort to involve themselves with that. So we end up with this book of yours in 2010, Wrong, Why Experts Keep Failing Us, and How to Know When Not to Trust Them. Great, great book. And more importantly, this is the setup now for what we're going to dive into, which is in 2005, this fellow, John Ioannidis. Am I getting that right in the pronunciation? You had it phonetic in your article. So Ioannidis, professor at Stanford University, pretty much of epidemiology and kind of meta studies, published this paper in the Public Library of Science. And the title of the paper, oh God, this dang thing always does this. Let's see. Matthew, can you read the title of the paper for me? I can't read it. My little windows are over and I keep clicking on it. Matthew, are you there?
I
David,
can read it for you.
Yeah, David, how about if you read that title? I
Yeah,
can't read.
why most published research findings are false.
Exactly. 2005, you read the first sentence of the summary. He says there is increasing concern that most current published findings are false. I mean, how earthquake generating can you possibly make a statement for the whole science world and biomedical world? Then you had your article in 2010 that I happened to read on the way to an epidemiology conference I was going to speak at. And I got there and all the epidemiologists had already read it. It had just come out like a month earlier. And this great article, Lies, Damn Lies, and Medical Science. And doggone this thing with these windows up here. Grr. How about if you read the subtitle there at the top for me, David?
Yeah, I have to peer at it too. It's pretty small. Much of what medical researchers conclude in their studies is misleading, exaggerated, or flat out wrong. So, why are doctors, to a striking extent, still drawing upon misinformation in their everyday practice? Dr. John Ioannidis has spent his career challenging his peers by exposing their bad science.
Thank you very much. That's great. And so there you see it, 2010. This was a great article, and I've met a number of faculty, medical school faculty, that have told me they continue to use this in courses. It's such a good article, and it's really focused on that. But it's this basic thing. There was misinformation there, and I think it caught my attention because I'd made these two films on the attacks on science of evolution science and climate science in 2006 and 2008, and so I was already kind of headed in that direction. And it seems to me this was the whole fire alarm. Like, look, your whole profession is on fire with this enormous rate of misinformation. And then, it should have been a warning. There should have been a congressional committee come together or something to address this to get ready for the possibility of we have some sort of event that would hurl a huge amount of science information at us. The event happened with the pandemic. Nobody was prepared for it. It was an absolute nightmare. I ended up on Eric Topol's podcast talking about it. He's top epidemiologist, and he titled the episode, what was it? Just not clusterfuck, but something to that effect. Historic botch job, he called it. And that was his label for what happened with CDC and everybody else responsible for trying to communicate this effectively. So, okay, so now this is our jumping off point for discussion. This simple question to begin with. Matthew and I've got several questions that we'll open up to everybody else joining in the discussion. But this is a starting point. Did Ioannidis' work even matter? And included in there would be your article. He did the right thing and nobody proved him wrong. And wasn't there a secondary study that came out that tried to claim he was wrong? And then when they repeated what he'd done, they found the same thing. By God, he's right. So, yeah, how about if we start with that question? Did his work even matter?
Yeah, you want me to jump into
Yeah,
that?
oh, yeah, yeah. No, we're
Yeah,
starting with
sure.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So I think yes, the answer is yes, but maybe not as much as we might have hoped. And I don't think that's necessarily an indictment. It's certainly not an indictment of Ioannidis or his work.
Right.
It's also not necessarily an indictment of the science community or of anyone else.
Why not?
One thing I like to point out is let's take a step back here and just recognize science is really hard. Getting at truth is a difficult endeavor. And we really shouldn't be surprised that scientists get it wrong most of the time. They're tackling the most difficult questions. They're doing it in a rigorous way that really makes it even much more challenging. They're not winging it. They're not doing it from their guts. They're trying to prove it. That is really, really tough. The easier questions in science have all been answered. They've been cherry picked. And increasingly, we're left with harder and harder, more and more complex questions. I mean, look at the state that physics is in these days. I mean, it's hit an absolute wall. It's hardly getting anywhere, at least in terms of fundamental physics. So this is super hard. Scientists are, I think, doing a phenomenal job, and even so, their work comes out being wrong most of the time. So what can Ioannidis or anybody do about that? It's our universe. It's the nature of science. So we can't expect that to change. Certainly, an article in the Atlantic isn't going to change that. And even
Could have.
all the wonderful work that Ioannidis has done, and some of his peers who have also looked at these questions, there are certain things that can and have been done, a better job of analysis, putting more fences around the kind of research that's considered acceptable. And all this stuff helps. It's not going to solve the problem, though.
Okay, you mind if I debate with you on some of these things?
Sure, please.
We different opinion, because I'm of a different opinion. I think that they haven't done a great job. And I think the first question is that against the backdrop of what's gone on throughout the last 3 to 4 decades of this atomic bomb of information that got set off back when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, I began to see it. That's why I left science. I could see the writing on the wall that this is going to end up being a mess, that nobody seems to be responding to this. And one of the catchphrases that we live by with the work we do with the ABT is from a Silicon Valley communications guru who one of their little rules of thumb is nobody buys a solution without a problem. And this is our challenge is that so many of these organizations we try and work with don't feel they have a problem. They think they're doing a good job with the science. And, it's up to the public to figure out how to make use of what they do. They don't see any responsibility to figure out how to make their science understandable and of use. And that becomes the fundamental divide right there. And so I would argue back to you that you're saying that, scientists do what they can. And I see a different side of it. And I think that they actively dismiss this as a problem, communication, don't feel they have any responsibility. I've dealt with it at CDC. I did 5 visits there, and the communications people told me it was a nightmare. The scientists say, get out of our lab. We're here to try and help you communicate your stuff. And they say, we don't care about that. We're here to do the research. You people figure out how to do it. So there's constantly a tension between these two cultures of the research scientists and then the humanities people that fill out the communications realm. Do you think?
I'm sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, Charles.
Randy, I think that's a different aspect of the issue. So what David's saying is the act of doing science correctly is very difficult. And what you're saying is the act of that the science world is not communicating their results. And those are kind of distinct things. So it's like what you're saying, I think is true, but it doesn't
what I'm saying,
what David is saying.
What I'm saying is that in the wake of, first off, the Unides article in 2005 that gave the solid piece of information, and then the communications public relation exercise that David did in 2010, put it into a broader language through the Atlantic to show this is a potential crisis. And then the net result of the whole science world just shrugging and saying, well, that's just not a problem. And that's again what we're up against so much is
Randy, I agree with Charles here. There's
Yes.
actually been a big response in science with respect to understanding the replication crisis and the statistical problems that led up to this. And so the practice of science has changed substantially in the last 15 years, in part in response to Unides's article. Now, what hasn't changed is the communication of those results to the public. And I think that's what Charles was getting at.
Okay, one step at a time then. Let's go back with that, David, to you were saying that there's been some response to the Unides article, and tell us more on that. And you agree with what Kent's saying, that there really was widespread recognition of that being a problem. Yeah, your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Yes, I think scientists completely embrace the idea that there was just a lot of slop out there and it could be tightened up. Most scientists manage to think this because they think it's everybody else that's producing slop. So they want to fix everybody else, not themselves. But that's okay. They get fixed along the way with them. So there have been a number of things that have been done to really try to reduce the unnecessary part of what ends up being published as bad research, or research that doesn't hold up. You can't do anything about the fact that these are hard problems that are going to naturally produce a lot of misfires. But what you can do is, for example, look at some of the problems that everybody acknowledges, such as the file drawer problem. If you come out with negative results, I know that this is something you love to talk about, Randy. It gets filed away, whereas positive results are much more likely to get published, and novelty is embraced. So the very existence and increasing popularity, for example, of PLOS, is a great tool for trying to avoid this kind of cherry picking and bias towards articles that are going to seem more interesting and novel. And a lot of stuff has been done to try to stem a huge tide of statistics fudging. I mean, we've seen, for example, in medical research, there's been a virtual epidemic of doctoring images. And now there are a huge
wait.
number of
Hang on. Slow that down. Can you tell us, people like me don't really know that epidemic. Let's hear some detail on that. Doctoring images.
Oh, yeah, sure. So if you just look at the huge number of retractions that have been taking place over the past, say, 5 to 10 years, and how many people have been outed, how many scientists have been outed as fudging data. A lot of that is simply people have gotten very good at being able to tell when an image has been doctored. So the classic example is you look at a strip that indicates which genes are present in a sample or which genes are active in a sample. And there's a classic sort of strip. It looks kind of like a bar chart. Well, it turns out a lot of those end up being doctored. The simplest way to doctor it is you simply substitute a different strip for the one that's supposedly showing what you're trying to show. And these are being detected. And so it's much harder to slip these by now. And I think that's a huge advancement in getting rid of some of the real offenders in putting out bad research. And that's just one example. I think there are dozens of ways that research is being tightened up. So again, I don't think it's going to solve the fundamental problem of how hard this is and the fact that scientists are throwing themselves almost by definition of science into things that aren't super well understood. So, of course, they're going to get a lot of stuff wrong and make a lot of missteps. But at least getting rid of the stuff that can be fixed, I think a lot of that absolutely is happening.
So, but to get back to the Ioannidis study and our basic, there's a power and importance to simplicity in communication. And that's the bane of the academic world is obfuscation. We point endlessly to the paper by Michael Crichton in 1975 called Medical Obfuscation, where way back then in 75 already, he was seeing the writing on the wall, which is if your profession gets so consumed with this language that's so indirect and so obfuscated, you're going to end up with literature that is unusable. That was never heeded, his paper back then. And things have just gotten more and more kind of congested. But in the interest of simplicity, Ioannidis did this tremendous favor to the whole biomedical community of boiling it down to a simple statement that PLOS paper, didn't have a whole bunch of obfuscation with it. It had a headline and it had that first sentence of, look, the majority of your information is noise. So the problem was poised very clearly there. The question is, where's the simple one for one answer to it? Namely, like I was pointing to the 9/11 Commission report, where's the National Academy of Sciences Commission report that they did in response to Ioannidis? And I'm guessing that there never was anything that singular. The science world doesn't think singularly enough, and then they can't figure out why the communication is a nightmare today with misinformation. They don't know what they're going to do with misinformation. It's just the information maelstrom is hit. The pandemic demonstrated how bad it is, and I don't see anybody talking in terms of addressing this need for concision and simplicity. It's just not seen as a problem. Was there a singular 9/11 style commission report done in response to that's what I was asking for Ioannidis. I know there were lots of little editorials written and people did little studies and things like that, but did anybody synthesize it to the extent that he synthesized it?
Well, no, is the short answer. And the scientific community really resists any sort of policing. And certainly you can say, well, that's a problem. If without policing, they're not going to solve the problems that they'd like to solve. On the other hand, when you look at efforts to police science, they're not very pretty. And I'm not sure that we have a good history of policing science and that it's even something that can be done. It's a little bit, it sort of goes against some of the very nature and essence of science to police it. But on the other hand, you raise a good point. Some good would come out of some sort of centralized, highly credible authority
Yes.
saying, look, this is okay and this isn't. That hasn't been done. It's hard to see what body would do that. You mentioned the National Academy of Sciences. They have no control over what happens in science. They tend to be pretty low impact.
They could and they should. And when I made my film on the attacks on evolution science, I got into a bunch of email battles with the director there and the other people just saying, we don't get engaged in politics. And so what you had was the right wing attacking the whole field of evolution science, especially in Kansas, where we based a lot of the film. And the only defense being put up for the science world was being done by high school teachers on the weekends and evenings of them, with no budget at all, begging, isn't there some national science organization that can come help us? And there wasn't, there isn't. And then they can't understand again why they're in the mess that they're in. And there are some alternative mechanisms like this. For example, just a week ago, I thought was pretty amazing. On CNN, they had a thing about right now, the majority of states' governors are now telling all the doctors to get their vaccination advice for children from AAP, whatever that is, American Academy of Pediatricians, and to ignore CDC. So there's some leadership happening, which is pretty amazing. If only it could happen at a bigger scale. And then again, this harkens back to everything we've done looking at Michael Crichton's work, because Mike Strauss, who's part of our group here, he ended up bringing in Michael Crichton to AAAS to give a big keynote address in '99 that was accompanied by an article he wrote in Science. And in that article in '99, he said, here's what you do. There's going to be this nightmare of too much information coming. And the way you combat it is through a singular voice. And he talked about the good housekeeping seal, which is what existed in previous generations. And he said, you need to come up with some means of a good housekeeping seal for every discipline. And the one voice that can accept or reject this stuff when it comes out, none of which was listened to. And then, 6 years later, Ioannidis did his thing. And so it's still right now, I don't see that anybody's identifying this as a problem and putting together task forces to address it. And that's what's come up after the pandemic, as I said, with some of these epidemiologists say, why didn't Congress do something? But then now we're just getting into all the mess of today's politics, because if Congress had done something, I think as you point to, it would have been driven by a certain party that would have blamed all the scientists. Okay. Yeah, Charles.
Yeah. There's a factor here that I think partly explains the lack of movement on this, which is incentive structures. And everything, including science, has incentive structures, and people always follow their incentives. So I work in AI for health. I go to AI healthcare conferences, and the papers are only accepted if they have fancy, novel AI architectures. If they are simple from an AI point of view, but effective from a medical point of view, they are rejected, which means that if your incentive is to publish papers, you will always pursue fancy AI architectures and exclude applicability to the medical world. And so you say, well, why do we never get effective medical AI? It's because the incentive structures point away from that.
Well,
and until those incentives change.
Yeah, David, what do you have to say about all that? That's pretty fascinating.
I think that's the number one reason that we have the problems we do, the solvable problems. Again, not the main intractable problem of the difficulty of science, but in terms of a fixable problem, it's incentives that take us in the wrong directions. Charles is absolutely right. Publishing is still the coin of the realm. That's still what all incentives of science are tied to. Everything from tenure and salary and status and impact. You name it, it totally revolves around what you're able to get published in which journals. And ultimately, in the end, what makes a journal want to publish something is not that different from what makes a newspaper want to publish one cartoon over another, or what makes Netflix run one show over another more prominently in its opening screen. It's what do people want? Journals want to be read. They want to have high impact. They're going to publish the stuff that people read. And in the end, that screws everything up. That's the biggest single reason why we have some of the problems we do.
Well, and that's the narrative dimension there of that people are driven by stories and all those dynamics that go with them, and the things that are relatively simple to digest. Matthew, you got any people in the chat window that want to toss in?
Mike and Dean were earlier talking about the ideal world of peer review and the hope that we had for it, but how it's falling short. Mike, Dean, you guys want to jump in on that? Or Dean, did you have something else?
So actually, I have something else. I want
Sure.
to disagree with Randy on one thing, and then
no.
pivot the answer to David. Two things. One, you mentioned that so the governors across the country have pivoted their recommendation for vaccination to the Pediatric Association, and then you said you wish that there were some larger scale impact that we could have. I don't know how much larger scale impact you can have than 50 or so governors changing medical advice across all the states. I think that's pretty huge. That is big impact.
It was only a small little segment on CNN. It wasn't a headline, that broke through the media noise cloud.
Oh yeah, but it's going to affect what doctors do, which is going to affect children's health, which is direct. So I'm not talking about it in terms of a communications strategy, but I'm talking in terms of effect.
Mhm.
But the other thing that you raised was this concept of like a good housekeeping seal of approval or something like that. And I'm going to be a little retro here and say we kind of had that. We used to have a CDC that put
Yeah.
together
Oh, yeah.
amazing review boards. We used to have Health and Human Services that put together amazing review boards that looked at the literature, made recommendations, and we all tended to nod our heads and go, "Yeah, that's probably pretty good advice here." We're in a localized situation right now where that has now been discarded. Is the problem, and here now I'm pivoting to David, is the problem more that that system, that pre-existing system had huge flaws that we needed to address, or is the problem that we've just decided to take a functioning system and toss it off the table like a kitty cat?
Yeah, let me take a shot at that. It's the latter. The system was far from perfect before, but we did have a CDC and an NIH and a National Academy of Sciences and other sort of trusted institutions that didn't always come up with the right answer. They weren't always efficient. There were a lot of problems with them. They weren't the final answer to anything, and they had no real policing authority, but they helped a lot. They helped really separate some of the wheat from the chaff. They really mattered. And they've been just hideously warped and destroyed and hollowed out and just really wrecked by the current administration. And so we've lost some really valuable institutions, and the process now of trying to figure out what's true and what isn't has gotten a lot harder because of it.
Yeah. Let's see, as we're going along here, Matthew, could you open up the PDF of David's Damn Lies paper and go to those last two paragraphs when you get there? Read us, because Matthew and I spent some time looking at those two paragraphs at the end, how you wrap it up, that article, and there's a lot in there. You able to get that?
Got it right here. Should I just go ahead and read it?
Yeah, yeah. Read those last two paragraphs.
Okay, let me blow it up here. We could solve much of the wrongness problem, Ioannidis says, if the world simply stopped expecting scientists to be right. That's because being wrong in science is fine and even necessary, as long as scientists recognize that they blew it, report their mistake openly instead of disguising it as a success, and then move on to the next thing until they come up with the very occasional genuine breakthrough. But as long as careers remain contingent on producing a stream of research that's dressed up to seem more right than it is, scientists will keep delivering exactly that. Quote, science is a noble endeavor, but it's also a low-yield endeavor, Ioannidis says. I'm not sure that more than a very small percentage of medical research is ever likely to lead to major improvements in clinical outcomes and quality of life. We should be very comfortable with that fact.
Okay, and before we let David comment on that, we have to get at least one woman in this conversation. Anahita, would you mind adding your thoughts to what you were just responding to there? Sorry. Are you
I
there?
should have known that if I put myself in the chat that I would be called on.
That's it, exactly. Yes.
It just hits very close to home. Like graduate school was a while ago now, but not that long ago. And I remember explicitly being told not to focus on incremental research because that wouldn't be funded. And I just remember thinking that's not what I got into science for. So it just makes me sad to hear that. I'm glad it was named. I had other comments, but I don't have any elaborations beyond what I put in the chat.
Okay, so David, can you pick up on those last two paragraphs there?
Yeah, what we're hearing is that a big part of the problem is that we're trying to make science more than it really is. Science is a groping around in the dark that most of the time is going to misfire and do things that are unimportant, unhelpful, wrong, messed up, or as Anahita just pointed out, a little bit incremental. And I mean, let's talk about sort of why nobody does validation. I mean, talk about, it's bad enough if you do something that's only slightly incremental. If you just repeat someone else's study, what's that going to do for your career? Who's going to read that article? And yet validation is supposed to be critical to science. So once we start putting these big expectations on science, that sort of feeds the terrible incentive system, and that in turn leads to a lot of bad research getting out there because it instills biases in researchers. And if they have biases towards any sort of research, towards any sorts of findings or results, towards any sorts of publication over others, they're going to find ways to achieve it. And that's going to throw off the rightness rate.
So at the core, and the reason that it drew my interest, those last two paragraphs, is that what you're talking about in those two paragraphs is public relations. And what you're talking about is that the science world really ought to find a way to shift the public's perception of science. That's what you've said kind of verbatim there. That is public relations. That's image management. And in a perfect world, that would be really nice if the public could lower their expectations. How do you actually make that change? And the fundamental divide that I ran into in the work I did with AAAS in particular, American Association of Advancement of Science, is this belief in PUS, the public understanding of science, and that we need to basically yell at the public and say, put in more effort to understand how science works. Where my philosophy is the science world needs to bear the burden and figure out how the public works. There's the basic gulf there. And the public, that's the narrative versus numeric divide. And the public just perceives everything in terms of narrative principles. And they're caught up by n equals 1 is fine with them. They don't know why that's bad at all. They're more than happy to take the one anecdote, and that's what we saw in the pandemic. The one anecdote of the nurse who got the vaccine and had a seizure and died, that was enough data for them. They didn't need n equals 5 million, whatever. And so endlessly, my advice to the science world is you're never going to get this public to be science literate. And that's where I parted company with a whole bunch of science journalists long ago, is that it's just not realistic. Yeah, Charles.
I want to highlight a comment Dean made in the chat a while ago. And Dean, maybe you can just say that about the fundamental contradiction that science is built on failing all the time. And yet people want to trust science, and science does produce value. And so how do you communicate that to the public? Say, on the one hand, yeah, we always fail. But on the other hand, you should trust what we say because in aggregate, we have come up with some good solutions. That's a very tough story to tell, right?
Okay, and so
for putting that better than I did.
Just one moment on that, which is there's the fundamental divide, because what we work with are these narrative principles. And at the core of it, one of the best resources we have is the book Story by Robert McKee. And in his second chapter, he goes through these 8 principles, properties of arc plot, the age-old structure of stories going back 4,000 years. And number 4 that we always settle in on is the broad audience has a need for certainty. It's called the omniscient narrator. When you read a novel, you don't want the narrator to make mistakes. You don't want them to have no confidence, like, I think this is how it happened. You want there to be complete certainty. That's the mass audience. And there's the fundamental divide, is they're looking for a voice of complete certainty. And then here's the science world saying, we make a lot of mistakes. You just got to bear with us. Those two don't match up. And the answer to it is, my advice to the science world is learn these narrative principles, learn what the landscape looks like, and don't lead with mistakes. Don't lead by saying, yeah, we made a whole bunch of things that were wrong. You're just blowing all your, I know you think you're being honest, but it ain't that simple. And that's what framing is about. And in 2005, there was an essay in Science that I'm thinking of getting back in touch with the authors I used to be buddies with, about framing science. And the science world lit up in bonfires with rage over, how dare you talk about framing our science? But that's what it's about, going to the public. You've got to frame it. You got to understand there are all these minefields that you step on and everything will blow up. And telling the public that you make a lot of mistakes in your career does not work. Do you see how that doesn't work, David?
Yeah, it definitely doesn't.
Yeah.
One thing I want to get back to something Anahita referred to sort of tangentially, which is what happens in graduate school. What is that learning process in a science PhD? And a lot of it is about sort of restructuring your idea of what a good story is. so that it's more based on what's more likely to lead to publishable science, rather than lead to a good narrative, or a great story. So really, scientists go through this, we could call it a brainwashing process, where they're stripped of the ideas that most of the public has about what it is they should be reading and thinking and how to tell a story. And they're given this whole new idea of how to tell a story. And it works among scientists. When they try to reach the rest of the world, they're a disaster because we don't think the way scientists do. And what happens is scientists end up being dependent on science journalists to get these stories out. And that brings up a whole new set of problems because science journalists cannot fill that gap. Science journalists tend to fall way short of doing what we need to do in getting the right science stories out. Science journalists tend to have bachelors in science. Most of them do. I do. I have a bachelor's degree in physics, no advanced degrees. And the result is we tend to end up with a very romanticized idea of how science works. And we tend to tell scientists stories as if they're heroes bringing us the truth. They've gone through this amazing, neat, clean, elegant process, and they've gotten to an amazing insight. And now I, the science journalist, have the honor of sharing it with the public. And in the end, that doesn't begin to reflect how science works and what the chances are of this story.
Okay. But right there on that, isn't that what Ioannidis did? Wasn't that the essence of that whole PLOS article? Was saying, guess what? These scientists aren't heroes. The majority of what they're publishing is wrong.
Well, yes and no. Ioannidis does think scientists are heroes. And
Yeah.
by the way, so do I. They're just not heroes in the way we think they're heroes. The way
we
most
meaning
of us
the public.
think they are.
Yes.
Yeah, we meaning the public and most people. Yeah. They're not heroes because they're always getting right answers. They're heroes because they've thrown themselves into a noble endeavor of trying to get at the truth, not because they do actually get at the truth. Most of them never do at any important truth. But they're doing the best they can. And every so often, in aggregate, it helps the world advance in wonderful ways. So yes, they're heroes, but we see them as the wrong kind of hero. We have the wrong idea of heroism, and science journalists make that much worse.
Okay, in a couple minutes, we're going to shift into the other topic, which is nutrition science, things like that. But Matthew, any other things going on in the chat window you want to highlight?
Oh, so much. Where to begin? Albie, you're talking a little bit about AI literacy at your institution. Did you want to chat about that?
Yeah, I was just saying it's sort of the similar as this Netflix conversation that's going on in the chat too. We've been talking about AI, right? How to put it, implement it in schools and ethics and blah, blah, blah. But there was always this thread of we need to teach the public to be more critical thinkers about AI. And I'm just like, dudes, they're not going to be more critical. I mean, you can teach them a little bit of skills, but fundamentally people are critical thinkers. They're not, whatever. And I was like, as an institution of higher learning, I think it's university's job to be like, we are the self-selected critical thinkers, but we need to package that and create, whatever guidelines we think people should be using. I think it's the onus is on the institutions to make that, to help guide society in that way. But it's always this, but it to me, it falls back on the communication thing of like, people just need to know better. And we're just going to magically make people know better and be more critical and think like a scientist. I'm like, no, right? So to me, it's just not going to happen. And then so to the point that this Netflix conversation is to me is like, again, I mean, there's a separate argument about whether or not I agree with entertainment's decision.
Okay, hang on. Some of us have not been reading the chat window. Please give us a summary of what's going on about Netflix.
Is that Netflix entertainment is saying our audience is not paying enough attention. Like they're multitasking when they watch our movies. Therefore, we need to adapt our content to meet the audience, whereas science
basically by restating the plot to the audience at least 3 times during a movie to make sure it sticks with the audience.
Interesting. As well as second screen programming, as well as stuff
So
that's less
idea
narratively challenging. Yep.
Right. The idea that whether we agree with fundamentally or not, it's just the entertainment industry says this is where our audience is. This is how we need to adapt. And science continues to say we need to make the audience pay attention. We need to make the audience critical thinkers. We need to teach the audience more stuff. That's the only way to do it. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's like that's just a dead end that we've been chasing down for decades.
Yeah, whereas Netflix adapted to the reality of the audience.
Absolutely.
That's
meet the audience where they're at, right? It's
and then that results in shifting baselines, you know.
Right, but this is a key point of ABT. Like one of the first rules, maybe the first rule: who is your audience? Park House is who is your audience. If you're not speaking to them, you failed before you started, and that's what you're saying, Albie. That Netflix understands and they are paying attention to their audience. And if science fundamentally says we need to fix our audience, we've lost, right? So that's
I totally agree with that. That's it right there. Exactly.
Science keeps finding new ways to say the audience needs to do better.
There you go. And that's what I was saying is that goes back to the 1950s in the UK, where they formalized this whole philosophy of PUS, public understanding of science, which is exactly what you just said. The public needs to work harder to understand us. And it's kind of, the other way around. More, Matthew?
Oh, so much. I got caught up in another conversation.
Rick also had something to say.
Rick, let's go to you. Thanks, Charles. Charles, you're my backup guy. If I'm ever like in one-shot conversation, I can always.
And actually, I also saw a comment in there about something going on with National MPS, and whoever made that, if they could jump in after Rick. But yeah, go for it, Rick.
Thanks, Charles. So as I'm listening here, thinking about this being an ABT session again, we've had the setup. We've identified the problem. So David, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's the therefore? What's the solution?
Yeah, wow, you have really put me on the spot. So I would first of all claim I don't have a solution. I've always despaired of being able to solve this problem. Let me point something out. And, some of you might not like hearing this, but let me just give you an inarguable fact. Now, I'm not necessarily a big fan of IQ and what it means and whether we should judge people that way. And I'm not going to say anything good or substantial about IQ, but as a matter of fact, an average IQ is defined as 100. Half of the public has an IQ below 100. Now, make of that what you will. That is a fact. I don't know what you think. It's up to you. I'm not saying one way or another that a person with a 90 IQ is going to be able to process in terms of an article about artificial intelligence or vaccines or, fundamental physics. You can decide for yourselves. I do think, speaking more generally, it is a bridge too far to expect the public, much of the public, to really do well in comprehending what scientists are up to. This again is supposedly the job of the science journalist. It doesn't work out very well. When I think of what might a solution be, what I tend to think is that we need ways basically of selling the public on narratives, and we need to abandon a lot of science's ideals about being really honest, being really transparent, being objective, and you're never going to sell good science stories to most of the public that way. I think we have to be ready to be more manipulative, a little bit dishonest.
There you're hitting on it. And the question is, what's the right word to do on that? And so just as a case study, and exactly what you're talking about, that I've written tons on and nobody's cared about, but The Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's movie, to be, quote, more manipulative, but mostly just this framing idea. That movie should have opened with a large public relations exercise for climate science. Should have begun by telling the story of what went on with the ozone hole. The problem was identified in the 80s. The Montreal Protocol came together and a solution was devised, and the world was making progress on that. should have then gone from there into El Nino, which in 1998, I think it was, I asked the marine biology course at USC in their opening little questionnaire thing of what you know, what is El Nino? And not a single one of 100 students know what El Nino was. 98, that baseline shifted immediately when there was a giant El Nino event. Today, everybody in the state can tell you. But that's another thing you could have done public relations. Look at what climate science has brought us. They've solved this, they've solved this, boom, 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 boom. Now we've got this climate challenge, and here's what's going on. That's the narrative structure, and that is framing. That is, you can call it manipulation, whatever, but it's playing into the public wanting to hear, first off, the dream of, oh my God, these guys really are that competent. And you overcome that before you get into it. You look at the movie, and it opens with icebergs and everything else like that melting and blah, blah, blah. And there was no narrative intuition whatsoever in that thing. That's how these things get botched. And that's the difference between here's how we see it, it's all problems, versus we know how your brains work. And in light of that, we're not going to start by telling you that we make mistakes all the time. It just isn't going to work with the general public. Now, who was it that had the NPS thing I saw in the chat window?
Yes, I put in the chat that my science is it's almost impossible to get out to the public now. The Park Science magazine has been stopped. It's difficult to get things on the website. It's difficult to get anything in social media, and that's a shame.
Sorry, can you say that again a little bit more slowly?
Sure. There was a magazine called Park Science, and that has been terminated now. And anything that the park wants to put on the website or on social media has to go to the regional office, and mostly all they want to hear about is safety things.
And that's just in the past year
science.
That's happened?
Right now. That's what's happening right now.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Welcome to the whitewashing. And let's see. Any more comments there? Oh yeah.
Andy.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Two things. First, I have an autobiographical confession. My son's name, 18-year-old son, is named Drew. His screen name is Drew. And so I panicked when I saw the name of that bomber come up. It was also Drew. I thought, wait, where's Drew? Thankfully, he's at school today. It could have been him. But here's what I really wanted to point out. I think there is a current in popular society that this community could take advantage of, and that is the increasing importance of or a focus on betting, prediction markets.
Oh yeah.
If you have any familiarity with the sports world, it is amazing how ESPN in a very short time has essentially become a betting network. They talk about the odds of XYZ all the time. They talk about prop bets all the time. Similarly, you don't have to do a whole lot of Googling to find out, especially among young men, even among young, low education men, the interest in prediction markets such that you can bet on literally anything.
Yeah, Polymarket.
This to me, Polymarket.
Right. And that other goofy name. Yeah. Right.
Kalshi, yeah. This seems to me a rising tide in society that has a lot of problems with it, but it is in a way kind of quantitative thinking come to life, or quantitative thinking coming to the masses. And maybe the way to bridge the divide between the science community and the general public is through this increasing emphasis in the lay public on thinking in bets. Would you bet on it? Might a scientist say, we are so confident in this finding that I would bet my mortgage on it, or I would bet $2.50 on it. Just a thought. I think the rising tide of betting, prediction markets, and the society at large may be a helpful tool.
Yeah, the New York Times podcast, The Daily, last week did a whole segment on that Polymarket that was pretty enlightening on all that. Exactly, it is a massive trend that's emerged. Don't know where it's going. Let's see.
I want to do one. Inject a note of optimism, and this I want to push against this term of manipulation that David, you said, or we have to lie, and kind of to your point, Randy. One thing I love about the ABT structure is you never have to lie. You never have to manipulate. It's not about that. It's about framing to reach your audience. And And I think that's a really important aspect of it, that there is no, I believe, no manipulation. You don't have to manipulate. You don't have to change facts. You don't have to bury
Yeah.
things. You just, it's an honest way to approach with narrative. So I think it's a very kind of honest tool in that sense.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because I think that's, Matthew, that's one of our longer term goals that we need to be working towards, is conveying that what the way we've evolved this thing, we've gone from the primary structure of the three words, and but therefore, and then we've on our own experientially over the last 6 years come to realize there are these six elements of the secondary model. And it's in those six elements that you're referring to. That's where all that power is. The dream is right there in the secondary level. And then it's a matter of trying to get people to understand that it's totally rational. It's not manipulation. It's not dishonest. This is just the way the brains are programmed, is that they want to get this context. And then what we've learned over the course of 6 years is that the three elements are not created equal. That setup stuff, that's 80%. The framing is 80% of your challenge. This is what I'm saying. So poor old Chris Mooney and what's his name?
Matthew Nisbet.
Matthew Nisbet, exactly. Yes. Yeah. You remember that framing?
Oh,
science?
yeah, I remember it very well.
Oh, all right. Give us your take on that, because this was really a fairly landmark thing. I'm at the point where Chris and I had a big falling out years ago, and I think I might get back in touch with them to say, you guys were way ahead of your time. So yeah, tell us, Kent.
Yeah, well, so back, what was it, about 2005 or so?
Exactly, 2005.
They had run across some work by the Berkeley linguist George Lakoff.
Yes.
About how important how you frame a question or a problem is. And they were arguing that the main problem scientists had is that we were not framing questions in a way that was accessible and meaningful to the general public. And they got a tremendous amount of pushback and criticism from the scientific community, who felt like they were either making things too simple or were manipulating people in dishonest ways.
Yeah, no, you're right. And they were trying to tap into the psychology literature,
Yep.
which is where that all had kind of begun. And the problem is that the psychology literature was just too overthought and complicated and wasn't pragmatic and practical at all. And I think we're at a point now where what we're seeing here with the blue material in the ABT structures, that's the framing right there. And as you're saying, Charles, we're realizing that is the be all and end all. And that's why we're telling people, before you start communicating, you've got to put in the time figuring out the framing and what what are our little elements there we got on the website now, Matthew. The first one is, what's your scope? Are you going to set up your ordinary world as enormous or tiny here? That's your first framing decision you have to make. The second one is, what's the goal of this stuff, the dream? They were ahead of their time. I don't think they quite knew what they were doing. I was buddies with them back then. And I went for beers a number of times with them in the middle of all the blowback, and they were miffed by it. Like, why are the scientists so mad at us? And I dealt with the same thing when I started getting involved with my Flock of Dodos movie, which was scientists. We don't want anything to do with Hollywood. They're a bunch of liars and cheaters, blah, blah, blah. And so there was a cultural backlash against it then. But it's 20 years later, and it's really a conversation that I think needs to be honed in on. That's really fascinating. Let's see. We got 18 minutes left. And so can we try and dive a little bit into your other article there, which was that great article I absolutely loved around, I think it was 2013. You did, it was on the cover of the Atlantic. And it was basically about, my take on it was the vilification of processed foods. Was that kind of roughly what it was? Remember, you and I had lunch with you at that organic restaurant in Santa Monica as you were writing it. And at the heart of it was the Michael Pollan crowd and the omnivore's dilemma, and their recommendation that everybody eat all your meals at Whole Foods. And you're pointing out that, number one, nobody can afford that. And number two, it's not clear that the science shows that processed foods are inherently evil. Is that somewhat on the money with what your article was about?
Yep, right on the money. Yeah, it's truer now than it ever was. I keep talking to the Atlantic about sort of revisiting the concept, not to repeat it, but I think of it now as the appalling science of ultra processed food, which has become such almost a meme now. Everybody's aware, and scientists talk all the time about the dangers of ultra processed food. They can't define it. There's no good definition of it. To me, I'm horrified at the idea of a lot of scientific discussions going on around something that hasn't even been defined. But putting that aside, the science behind it is some of the worst science I've ever seen. It's bad on its face. I mean, anybody could just look at the science and think, wow, these are just terrible studies. They're horrible. Um, and we seem to be basing all our policies and lifestyles, or many of us are, around this idea that anything that's processed, and especially ultra processed, whatever that means, is really bad for us. And you know, the biggest problem I see right now is that food is cheap, it's accessible, and it can be made very healthy. And we're losing one of the greatest tools we could possibly have in society by not paying more attention to how to get people to eat healthy processed food.
Can you give us a little bit of step-by-step journey since that article came out on the cover of Atlantic? Because I remember I talked to you shortly after that, and you said, "Wow, there's a lot of blowback on this thing."
Yeah.
What was the blowback? Tell us about that.
Well, classically, you can't change people's minds. And, you know, about some things people they're not invested in. I've found that people's idea on food is more deeply seated than their belief in religion. I found when you talk to people about their religious beliefs, most of them I find are incredibly open to hearing different ideas and questioning things. You talk to them about food, they're ready to punch you in the face. People get really angry and passionate and upset. I've had people break down in tears. You know, I don't want to upset anybody, but I don't think I changed a single person's mind. And so what happened is you have all these people who believe in the inherent evil of food that goes through large mixers or sits in a warehouse for 3 days or is sold by a company in a cheesy store. Their belief that that food is inherently evil and is killing us is so powerful that I just can't make a dent in it.
And is RFK Jr. really riding that wave in a big way right now?
Well, he is. He is. And as I mentioned to you in a note, Randy, I think what's particularly tricky about RFK in general, but especially in this case when it comes to food, is some of his ideas aren't really that bad, and they
Yeah.
get mixed with some really terrible ideas. So you're exactly right. He's able to sort of surf on the wave of ultra processed food being terrible to get across some really probably horribly bad, unhealthy, dangerous ideas. It's a toxic mixture, and it's just so sad and scary to me that right now tens of millions of Americans are embracing what RFK Jr. has to say.
It's crazy.
Dean, you had a comment.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm kind of curious to bring this back to the communications thread that we're here, which is that clearly somebody, some group, some consortium, some maybe I don't want to sound conspiracy, it might have been a generalized thing, really effectively communicated this peril of whatever we want to call ultra processed foods. How did they succeed? What were they so good at? Possibly it was leveraging off some sort of nearly instinctual feeling that many people have about certain types of food, but somehow they were able to frame this argument in a way that has resonated strongly in the way that, as Randy says, like we all know about this now. We all got it somehow. What was so effective about that communication strategy?
Yeah. Well, Dean, I think you're almost exactly half right in what you're getting at there.
I'll take
The
that.
story. So I look. I mean, I think it was something that happened over time because of lots of people. But I would put 60% of it right at the doorstep of Michael Pollan. And Michael Pollan is a phenomenal storyteller. He's wonderful. I wish I had half his talent. I would also have to be deeply dishonest because I think his messaging, what he actually wants to say, is stupid and wrong and dangerous. But he's brilliant at framing and telling stories, and he really sold it. On the other hand, I wouldn't give too much credit to framing here. I think, and you mentioned this, Dean, I think this played to something that people were ready to believe. And I think that has a lot to do with what gets sold to the public at any particular point in time. Clearly, good framing, good storytelling is a big part of it. But if it doesn't tie into something they either want to believe or already believe or are ready to believe, good luck in selling that story. And I think Pollen just told the right story at the right time.
That's
Essentially, if you're going to run at a wall, it's really helpful if the door is open.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting way to put it because I've thought for a long time about the idea of narrative landscapes. And when the landscape has been built, the audience is waiting for the one thing to crystallize it. And the one
Yes.
thing that always sticks in my mind was, you remember way back, was it Howard Dean was running for president and he had that one rally where he screamed out Yahoo and everything. And
Yeah.
that was the final straw. The whole country was waiting. Give us just one moment we can justify getting rid of this guy. And he finally fell into did that, and everything was there and crystallized. And overnight he was done. And then I remember the next day, ABC News came on and showed how nobody in the room heard him screaming "Yeehaw." It was only on the news reports that went out nationally. There was so much noise in the room; it was just his microphone picked it up. But that was it. Everybody, the story was already told and ready to go. Give us the one thing. And is that sounding similar to what you're talking about there? That, the landscape was
Yes.
all set and Pollen came along and he was the one guy that crystallized it. And
He
baboom.
was the yeah,
Yeah.
he was the yeehaw. He was.
Yeah.
That's what he was. I mean, look, if somebody who was deeply popular and that people really wanted to believe in, I think back to Barack Obama. If Barack Obama had been caught going yeehaw, it might have gotten some attention, and some of us would have felt a little embarrassed about it. It wouldn't have slowed things down substantially. No, I think you're exactly right, Randy. And yeah, that's a terrific example. Plus, it makes me laugh, which is extra bonus points.
I
Yeah.
know. And it was the idea that the science the next day basically said, look, nobody heard it in the room. Nobody cared by then. He was already
Nobody cared.
thrown out. That was
Yeah.
all we needed. Hey, Elizabeth Stolberg, great to see you here. Did you have a comment you wanted to toss in there about Oreos or whatever it was or something?
I'm curious how you managed to change someone's mind about food. I don't think that's possible.
So a lot of people who already know me, like food policy is what I do. So they'll say to me like, so like Elizabeth, you know food and science. What do you think about organic milk? And it's a question of, all right, well, what are your values? You tell me what you value the most, and I'll tell you whether organic milk is worth your time. And you start there with their questions and listening to what they value. And then if something else comes along, like raw milk, where it's not about values, in my opinion, it's then it becomes then there's already a trust established. And I think the same can be true of vaccines. I had a neighbor just across from me who didn't want to vaccinate her kids because she was scared of something being in their body that was foreign. And I was like, oh, well, okay, well, let me tell you how vaccines work. And she was only interested in hearing that message once we already had the respect and I already knew what the problem was, the reason that she didn't want to have her kids have these vaccines. So I had her respect, I had her trust. And then I said, okay, well, so it's like this, the vaccine goes in, your body reacts to it, and then the vaccine leaves. It's gone. The only thing that's left is your body's own immune system. And that was all she needed to hear. And then she got her kids vaccinated. So it wasn't like me telling her, you have to do this for the good of the world or for your kids, or you're a bad mom if you don't. It's like for food as well. You listen to what people's, yeah, well, gluten just always makes me feel awful. Oh, that's legit. Then don't eat it. That's all you. Like validating what they're
No,
what
that's
they're feeling.
really, really good. And you're making me a teeny bit sad that we don't have Brian Palermo around these days because that was our improv guy, Brian Palermo. That was what we brought him in for, which is that fundamental dynamic. And maybe this is why you've taken to the ABT from the very beginning. It's this fundamental dynamic of take the focus off of yourself and put it on the other person. And in so doing, listening to them. And that is incredibly hard for scientists, for starters, to take the focus off themselves. For academics, and in general, they're all used to the focus is on themselves. I'm the one with the knowledge. Here's how the world works, and it's really hard for them to do the reverse of listening to the other person. Doug Passon, you're not allowed to sit through one of these sessions without saying something. So surely you got something to tell us from the legal world.
Um, I always look at it through that lens, obviously. And, I think back to the beginning of the conversation where, you had really two problems you're trying to solve for. One was whether it was sound science, and the other was whether it was sound communication. And it just struck me as that disconnect. I understand why a scientist would say, I'm not here to be a communicator, I'm here to do my science. But in my world, there is no chasm between those two things. You have to be sound and credible on the legal stuff, but our fundamental job is to be able to communicate the truth of our case and the story of our client. So my problem is just always a different one, which is we know that we're supposed to do it, but nobody knows how to teach us to do it well. So I'm trying to think about how you fix that problem, that disconnect in the science community, because you may be beating your head against the wall trying to convince scientists who would rather just be in the lab head down doing their work to put their head up and speak to the world. And that just may not be how their brain is wired. So I feel like the scientists need to have like a communications cadre that's their job.
Well, and that's a leadership exercise, and there are still, in theory, some voices of leadership, namely National Academy of Science and AAAS. By the way, Matthew, can you find the link for Doug's podcast? Doug and his buddy and I did an episode last Friday that was pretty fun and interesting. And if you could,
so good.
Yeah, and you could throw that into the. Doug was in New York Times and Politico last week on his work in New Jersey. And what was the essence of the work? Is trying to get them to release people that have been cleared of charges?
No, the essence was challenging the president's unfettered abuse of power, because he's illegally appointing U.S. attorneys in these offices all around the country. And this is fundamentally a communication problem. What we were railing about for an hour on the podcast was that people have it's a very esoteric area of the law, and people don't really understand why this is important, and nobody's paying attention to it. So this is a great challenge. How do you communicate the import and make people understand how serious this is, and how it really is a canary in the coal mine for the complete and total abuse, weaponization of the justice system? They just tried to indict, my Senator Mark Kelly yesterday because he had dared to tell, enlisted people they have a right to refuse unlawful orders. But this is all fundamentally goes to the heart of, well, if you get the wrong people to head these offices, you can do it all, and nobody's paying attention. And by the way, I was listening all morning, which I should never do, but Pam Bondi was at the Senate, all morning.
How's that
going? Guess how many people question her about my important issue about why is she installing these illegally unqualified, unethical attorneys who are just unlawfully there and have been kicked out, summarily dismissed by judges. Guess how many people asked her about that? Zippo. It's not even on Congress's radar. So what am I supposed to do with that?
Keep working on the ABT. Take 2 ABTs and go to bed.
But the takeaway was, when I was in court, because I know Randy and I know the ABT, I was able to speak correctly. And there were press in there. And we spent 4 hours talking about the most minute legal esoterica and this statute and this subsection, and this blah, 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 blah. But the headline from Politico that night was terrifying abuses of power. And I felt like I won the day, because whoever was sitting in that courtroom for 4 hours heard my message that I kept coming back to. And that was their takeaway. And that's because of Randy's. That's because of Randy.
Excellent. And we are now at 1 to 2 minutes remaining. Matthew, any final things coming out of the the chat that you want to mention before we wrap this up? David, this has been tremendous. I hope you've enjoyed this. It was really great for us. You're just the best for journalists. And thanks for being a good sport and letting us challenge you and debate all these things back and forth. Um, and let's see, anything to wrap it up with, Matthew?
Elizabeth, you had a comment about scientists being self-selecting. Did you want to tell us about that one?
Oh, real quick, and then I gotta go. But
Yeah, sure.
I do, we were talking about scientists being self-selecting, you know, and not every scientist needs to be a great communicator. It's going to come to some, it's not going to come to others. But I feel very strongly that it is a scientific society's role, so AAAS, or even like the much more like smaller groups. Like I work with the American Society of Plant Biologists, the Entomological Society, and that's their job. They're the ones that need to have this kind of training so that they can communicate the science.
Yeah, you're right. They're the more social branch of the whole profession. Exactly.
That's right.
Excellent. Okay. David, thank you so much. And really, really appreciate it. And I will send you a follow-up email, and the whole group really thanks you.
Thank you. What a wonderful group. Incredibly thoughtful and interesting and provocative. Great job, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a year of incubating and selecting this whole crowd, and we have fun. So, all right, everybody stay tuned. And in a week or two, we'll line up the next guest and do another fun session like this. And thanks to all of you. Those are great comments and questions. See y'all later. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye, gang.
Bye.
Thanks.